Scientists aren't really sure exactly when humans first started using speech. While there are beautifully preserved tablets of the earliest written forms of language, there is no fossilized evidence of the spoken word. But at some point, our bodies physically evolved for just that. Our voice box dropped lower in the throat, and the area above the vocal cords lengthened, enabling us to make a wider and wider variety of sounds. And ever since, for good or ill, we have been using sounds, words, names, language, to plan, to record information, and to communicate everything from beauty to awe, to fear, to love, to promises made between two or more parties. Our words matter. We even use them to express our identity. Our pronouns matter. Language is the primary means by which humans convey essence, what really matters. Long before the printing press, and even before monastic scribes painstakingly wrote out scripture by hand, word by word, the word was mostly spoken, handed down from generation to generation, an English translation of a Latin translation from Hebrew or Greek of something someone once said in ancient Sumerian or Aramaic or whatever language our ancestors spoke. We could be grateful that William Tyndale and others translated the Bible into English in the early 16th century, without which our lectionary would sound very different. Tyndale's biblical text is credited with being the first Anglophone translation to work directly from the Hebrew and Greek. Thanks to the invention of the printing press, it became the first mass-produced biblical translation made available to the masses, at least those who could read. Ultimately, Tyndale's translation cost him his life. His translation was condemned and banned by church authorities, and almost all copies of his first 1526 New Testament were burned, as was he at the stake, convicted of heresy. Words matter. Anyone who has ever been labeled as other or lived life on the margins can tell you that. Without Tyndale's translation, we would not have the King James Version of the Bible, even as our lectionary proclaims a translation called the New Revised Standard Version, which, I hesitate to say, given Tyndale's fate, I think sometimes gets it wrong. In the second letter to the Corinthians, for example, our lectionary has St. Paul declare, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." Whereas the King James Version has the apostle proclaim, "Behold, behold, now is the day of salvation." It's different, right? So too in the passage from Mark's Gospel in which Jesus calms the sea, we hear that the disciples were filled with great awe at the sight of Jesus stilling both wind and sea. But in the King James Version, they are not filled with great awe, but they feared exceedingly. Two very different ways of translating and understanding the original Greek word used in that sentence. There is a Greek word for awe, theos, but that's not the word being used here. The word being translated is phobos, in which you might recognize the origin of the word we use for fear of something, phobia. I think the very first English translators got it more correctly. The disciples feared exceedingly. They were not filled with great awe, they were terrified. Terror and awe may have something to do with each other, but they are not the same. The disciples, the text tells us, had brought Jesus into the boat just as he was. That is, we can imagine tired, vulnerable, human. In the midst of a great storm, he slept. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" they screamed, waking him. He rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. Suddenly, their teacher seems no longer tired nor human, but powerful, sovereign, almighty, one with authority over the forces of nature and the things that threaten physical life. Just as he was, turned out to be something, or rather someone, far greater than what the others first assumed. Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? On this Pride Sunday, these gospel questions particularly resound for LGBTQ plus folks and our allies. Who are you, just as you are? And then, who then is Jesus to you, to us? How we talk about ourselves and our relation to Jesus matters. St. Paul might as well have been writing to our generation when he urged the Corinthians to widen their hearts. Citing Isaiah, "At an acceptable time I have listened to you, and on a day of salvation I have helped you." St. Paul ties the grace of reconciliation to salvation, that salvation isn't merely about individual deliverance, but communal relations, mutual love, and forbearance. Through Christ's self-emptying work on the hard wood of the cross, God is reconciling the entire world, all of humanity in all of its translations, Jew or Greek, black or white, gay or straight, trans or cisgendered. All of this is beautifully interpreted by the old-fashioned word we hear over and over throughout the Bible, the Hebrew word berit, or as we hear it in translation, covenant. A covenant is a relationship between two partners who make binding promises to each other and work together to reach a common goal. Indeed, we hear this word in the assigned lection from 1 Samuel, in which the souls of Jonathan and David are bound one to another. Covenants between individuals, between rulers and their subjects, and particularly those made between God and humanity, are perhaps the greatest theme that threads throughout the Bible. They are at the heart of God's redemptive plan to restore us to right relationship. Promises of land, of protection, descendants, safety, forgiveness, redemption, life, and life everlasting. Beginning with Genesis and the promise made by God to Noah, and fulfilled in Jesus' body and blood given for us. Over and over, the people forget God's covenantal relationship with humanity, that in God we all belong. And again, it is God who reminds. And when we forget, God tells Noah, we need only look to the colors of the rainbow. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth." From Noah to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to David and throughout the Bible, God makes and remembers this rainbow promise, a holy covenant to be and stay in committed relationship. And so often that relationship is pictured as a kind of marriage in which God speaks figuratively of Israel personified as God's wife. And rightly so. A covenant is an agreement between two parties that binds them together and conveys not only the idea of close relationship and friendship, but even oneness and identity, as for example, in the marriage covenant, where two mystically become one flesh. So what are we to make of this covenantal love language as it appears in 1 Samuel? Where Jonathan's soul is bound to that of David's? We need only to consider the words of the text for ourselves. The soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And what immediately follows? Saul took David that day and would not let him return to his father's house, which sounds not unlike the kind of marital family arrangements referred to in Genesis. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his partner, and they become one flesh. We might rightly see Saul taking David that day as the relationship of a father-in-law to his son-in-law. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword and his bow and his belt. Those of us who gather not only beneath God's rainbow reminder of covenantal relationship, but also beneath the rainbow-colored pride flag this month and around God's rainbow people can read between the lines. As a people who fought for the right to marry under the law, we can see this for what it surely was, a marriage ceremony in everything but name. In fact, there is marriage language all over this passage, as well as the fingerprints of interpreters and translators who have gone out of their way to avoid the true meaning of this passage, calling Jonathan and David's covenant everything from a simple political pact to an exemplary form of platonic friendship. But if we were to read on in their story, we would encounter a grieving David at the news of Jonathan's death, crying out, "Jonathan, my brother, thy love to me was wonderful, passing that even of the love of women." While Jonathan and David's relationship surely involved friendship, the words used in this queer passage are really marriage language. There are words in both Hebrew and Greek for friends, but this is not friendship language here. In fact, if we were to look at where else in Scripture this kind of covenantal love language appears, we would find clear parallels in so many biblical relationships. Those of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, of Jacob and Rachel, Elkanah and Hannah. Indeed, the intimate relationship of God and Israel as it is depicted in the Song of Songs, or even our relationship to Christ in that same book of the Bible, as well as elsewhere, where Christ is the bridegroom and we, the church, are his bride, the marriage of the Lamb. Even as we look to the consummation of that marriage, the joyful, intimate, and eternal union of Christ and his church, in which we are all betrothed. For far too long, interpreters and translators have used language to oppress and silence, to censure and erase our place in Scripture, to claim that God's rainbow is monochromatic. Yet we are not colorblind. God has given us eyes and brains that together are capable of translating light into the myriad of color combinations that live unseen in daily light, but whose splendors are revealed when refracted through the prisms of human hearts. Let us make ourselves ready then to receive our bridegroom. As we gather beneath the many colors of the pride flag this month, let us not put any obstacles in anyone's way, but open wide our hearts, remembering God's rainbow promise of right relationship and our redemption through Jesus Christ. For in the marriage of the Lamb, we are all bound together soul to soul. Our faith in God, in whom all belong, is our holy covenant. Our dowry has already been paid, the extravagant sacrificial work of our bridegroom on the hard wood of the cross, and the redemption of God's people completed in his glorious resurrection. All that's left, my friends, is that joyous wedding feast, in that promised new earth and new heaven, where in God we all belong.